Mr. President, Mr. Minister, Ambassador, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed more than an honor to be asked to deliver the first Jaakko Iloniemi lecture and to do so in the presence of both the President of the Republic and of Jaakko Iloniemi himself. But before doing that, let me just express my personal thanks to you, because I remember during the decades coming to Helsinki as what was in those days a young man. You were always willing to share your wisdom with a visitor from the other side of the Baltic Sea, and I belong to those that have benefited tremendously from that over the years. Thank you. To say that we are living in interesting times is certainly no exaggeration. Historians will look back at these days of ours as a watershed in the history of our countries and of our continent. As we gather here, war is raging on the plains of the east of Europe. Millions of people have been forced to flee. Cities are being reduced to rubble by constant bombardment. The industrial infrastructure of a major European country is systematically destroyed. 3 months into the war, tens of thousands of soldiers have already lost their lives. Our Europe, our world is changing. Some of you might still remember the famous phrase of the first European Union security strategy less than 2 decades ago, which proudly stated, and I quote, "Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free." And the violence of the first half of the 20th century has given way to a period of peace and stability unprecedented in European history, end of quote. There was, of course, an amount of hyperbole in this. We had just come out of a decade of fairly brutal wars of disintegration in the Balkans, but still, it caught the mood of those years. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, slightly more than a decade earlier, had ushered into an era of global cooperation and democratic advance, and nowhere was this more evident than in our part of the world. Finland and Sweden, as the President just alluded to, had joined the European Union together in 1995, thus ending a long, different period of slightly different sorts of neutrality, and the 3 former Soviet republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were on the final run towards membership of both the EU and NATO. The same warm midsummer day in 1995, when Esko Aho for Finland and me for Sweden signed our country's treaties of accession to the EU, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin was also present on Corfu and signed the ambitious partnership and cooperation agreement between Russia and the EU. But things clearly didn't turn out as we had all hoped for. The wheels of history continued to turn and did so in directions we had hoped could be avoided. I think it was during a couple of months in 2008 that the long summer of hope finally came to an end, and we entered a period of new turmoil and tension. The short war in August between Russia and Georgia was a complex affair. But suddenly, we saw not only that the threshold for Russia to use military power was lower than many of us had thought, but also, and perhaps even more ominously, that the respect for the established borders that had been proclaimed fundamental to the security of our continent was totally disregarded. For most of the time, this was still seen as perhaps just a blip. Soon the new US administration announced a reset of relations with Russia, and the EU, for its part, launched a partnership for modernization with Moscow. Some years later, in 2013, the very last American tank was withdrawn from the continent of Europe. As the clouds gathered again over the east of Europe in the autumn of 2013, the attention of the world was focused on the tragedy of Syria. But now Russia set itself on preventing Ukraine from entering into a relationship with the European Union that in fact wasn't too different from what Russia itself had aspired to some years earlier. But things have changed. Now, the ambition of Vladimir Putin was to set up a new Eurasian Union as a new center of power and influence on the continent, with Russia obviously in the driving seat, and Ukraine was fundamental to that project. He had already misjudged Ukraine when he tried to interfere in its politics in connection with the Orange Revolution in 2004. And now he gravely misjudged the country again. It was not for turning. But step by step he escalated his pressure on the economy, on the country, until its regime collapsed, and he decided to take the step of going to war to dismember Ukraine. On March 1st of 2014, in a most extraordinary step, he asked for and got the authorization of the Federation Council of the Russian Federation to use the Russian armed forces on the entire territory of Ukraine. By that time, of course, the operation to take over Crimea was already well underway, and the subsequent operation to try to carve out the eastern and southern parts of the country was under active preparation. Apart from taking over Crimea, again violating the borders of Europe, and getting control of parts of the Donbas region, his policies failed again. Ukraine consolidated its democracy, it proceeded with agreement with the European Union, and based on what it had experienced, it replaced its constitutional provision for neutrality with one about seeking membership of the EU and of NATO. It was a massive strategic failure for the Kremlin. The westward development of Ukraine, hardly perfect, but certainly determined, continued or even accelerated. And this set the course for what we see today. In the Kremlin rhetoric leading up to this war, there was a lot of talk about the eastern expansion of NATO as the core of the conflict, disregarding both that the last such expansion happened nearly 2 decades ago, that there had been virtually no new NATO facility or whatever in terms of forces in these countries prior to 2014, and that an imminent membership of NATO for Ukraine was certainly not in the card. But it wasn't NATO going east that was the core Kremlin concern. It was Ukraine going west. And of course it did so as a function of his democratic political system. In his different speeches, Vladimir Putin has made it clear that it was this that he deemed utterly unacceptable. With its democratic development and with its urge to cooperate and integrate with the rest of Europe, Ukraine risked turning into what Vladimir Putin called an anti-Russia. And this he could not accept. He had to act. He could not wait. The threat was growing by the day. That's more or less his own words. When the EU, in March of this year, after rather extensive debate, issued what they call its strategic compass, it opened in a very different way from the document nearly 2 decades ago that I cited earlier, and is worth quoting at some length. The return of war in Europe, with Russia's unjustified and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, as well as major geopolitical shifts, are challenging our ability to promote our vision and defend our interests. We live in an era of strategic competition and complex security threats. We see conflicts, military buildups and aggressions, and sources of instability increasing in our neighborhood and beyond. This is a message that is fairly stark, agreed by all of the 27 member countries. It has, of course, major consequences for the EU and for relations across the Atlantic and for our Nordic countries. The crimes committed by Russia are there for all to see. When after the Second World War, the International War Crimes Tribunals met in Nuremberg in Tokyo, they made it clear that the crime of aggression was what they called the supreme international crime. And it was for this crime that the senior leaders of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were sentenced. And it has remained the supreme crime under international law since then. Violating the borders and territorial integrity of states is a fundamental violation, not least of the Helsinki Accords. This was done by Russia in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 in Ukraine, and now has been done by Russia again, with the decision again to dismember Ukraine. We should remember that both when the Soviet Union was dissolved and when the same happened with Yugoslavia, respect for the established borders or boundaries between the different constituent republics was seen as fundamental to preserve stability and peace. It's obviously too early to predict the outcome of the military confrontation in the east of Europe. The first 3 months have clearly not gone as the Kremlin had expected. The political and the military battle for Kiev was lost, and the immediate military aim now seems to be to consolidate and gradually expand control of parts of Ukraine territory in the south and in the east. As we speak, the strong belief in Kiev is that they can win, and the strong conviction in the Kremlin is that it must not lose. We are in all probability heading for a lengthy war of attrition. Days of diplomacy look distinctly distant. The ultimate aim of war, beyond the immediate military, is, as von Clausewitz taught us, to break the political will of the opponent. And the question is, of course, will it break first in Moscow, or in Kiev, or in Washington, or in Brussels, or the capitals of Europe? That we don't know. What we do know is that the burden of war will build up. War is an exceedingly costly affair. But I think it's reasonable to assume that as long as the political will holds up in Kiev, it will hold up in Washington, and then also in Brussels, EU, and the capitals of Europe. And the critical question is whether this will be enough to ultimately break the political will in Moscow. I think it would be unwise to underestimate the stamina of Russia. Its army has certainly underperformed. Its economy will face hard times for years to come. It has effectively cut itself off from all of the West. But as long as its regime survives, the war will, in the one form or the other, go on. I noted that Dmitry Trenin, in a speech in Moscow the other day, said that, quote, "Today and for the foreseeable future, Russia is a country at war," end quote, war for the foreseeable future. And the war aims pronounced by Mr. Putin in his different speeches are very far-reaching. In our modern European history, the war that he has launched can only be compared with what Hitler launched against Poland in September of 1939. Unprovoked, massive, and with essentially the same declared aim. Hitler wanted Poland to disappear from the map of Europe. And Putin has been explicit in that he wants Ukraine to disappear from the map of our continent. For Hitler, a greater geographic space was considered a necessity for the third Germanic empire that he wanted to build. Eliminating Poland was a precondition for this, as was somewhat further afield, control of the breadbasket of Ukraine. For Vladimir Putin, an independent or even autonomous Ukraine is a direct threat to the existence of Russia. He talks about it as a life and death issue for Russia. And there is little doubt that the elimination of any element of or other vestige of statehood from the vast territory of Ukraine is for him the ultimate aim of this war. We should note that he has been explicit in saying that just grabbing some additional piece of Ukraine wouldn't be enough, since it wouldn't solve the underlying problem of Ukraine. The conflict would come back sooner or later, and in this is undoubtedly correct. Launching this war was insane. The fundamental problem for Vladimir Putin is that even if the mobilization of Russia were to gradually grind down the defense forces of Ukraine, strategic failure will be impossible to avoid. By his action, he has achieved in Ukraine that has gained internal strength and external credibility that further military onslaught can only strengthen even further. In this strategic sense, he can no longer win. He has taken Russia to the precipice of strategic disaster. 3 decades ago, our two countries sought membership of the European Union in order to make also our contribution to the building of a new order in our part of the world. An order that sought to dismantle the borders and the barriers of the past and build a Europe whole and free, democratic and dynamic. Now, in a very different situation, our two countries have decided to seek membership in the Atlantic Alliance and its military organization, in order not only to increase our own security, but also to make our contribution to stability in a period where this obviously is again under threat. I don't think this decision was made under the fear that we are facing an imminent Russian military threat. You might even argue that such a threat looks even less likely in the next few years. Both in military and economic terms, Russia in the years ahead will be substantially weaker than what we previously might have assumed. But it will be a Russia at war, also with us, as long as this present regime is in power. Weaker, but more desperate, and accordingly, in all probability, also more dangerous. It will see itself as fighting for its survival, and indeed, in the view of some of its leadership, for the very survival of Russia, and it will gear its different policies and actions accordingly. It is in this situation that it is necessary for our democracies to work as close together as we can in all of the European and Atlantic frameworks. We need a stronger military alliance in the form of NATO to deter the ultimate threat against our territories. And we need a stronger security alliance in the form of the EU to counter the many wider challenges that this situation might entail. And we need the two of them working as closely together as possible. And here I do believe that Finland and Sweden working together can make important contribution. The Russian challenge will be there. And meanwhile, other challenges have not gone away. Some decades ago, we hoped that our Europe would be surrounded by a ring of friends. Now we see the risk of us instead being surrounded by a ring of fire. South of the Mediterranean, the challenge is obvious. And there are certainly numerous in the entire region between the Nile and the Indus, and Europe isn't protected by vast oceans, at best just some narrow strips of water. In order to safeguard our security, Europe clearly needs better capabilities in a number of areas. I would argue that it's strategic capabilities, not primarily autonomy, that must be the focus of policy in the years ahead. Last week, we saw the attention of the United States focused on Asia. President Biden had key meetings in Seoul and Tokyo, and in Washington, Secretary Blinken outline the China strategy that had been in the works for some time. We must note that in spite of the impressive leadership that the US administration has demonstrated on the Russia challenge since last autumn, it is the challenge of China and stability in the Indo-Pacific region that will be the prime focus of the United States in the years ahead. Here, Europe must obviously do its bit as well, but perhaps our most important contribution would be to take a greater responsibility for the security of our own continent, thus allowing the United States to fully play its important role at the other end of the Eurasian continent. We will remain highly dependent on the United States for key capabilities of both horizontal and vertical escalation in order to deter from aggression here in Europe. But in numerous other respects, there is much more that we can and that we should do. In our northern part of Europe, we will now have a dramatically different situation in terms of the possibilities of security cooperation. In fact, it's the first time since the demise in the early 16th century of the Union of Kalmar that virtually the entire Nordic and Baltic world will be united within the same overall security framework. There's a referendum in Denmark on Wednesday. Without interfering too much in Danish politics, I just hope it has a positive outcome as well. In our capitals here in the north, we now need to think security not only nationally, as we often do, but we need to think security in this wider framework, perhaps from historic Narva in the east to Nuuk in the west, from Kirkenes in the north, perhaps in the high north, perhaps down to Krakow, touching the very center of Europe. It was some years ago that we started to take some steps towards security cooperation between primarily the Nordic nations. Now I believe it's time to look at this with new eyes and wider perspectives. NATO membership doesn't answer all questions, but it certainly opens up new possibilities. Here, there is certainly scope for important initiatives in the years ahead. In the immediate perspective, it is Kiev and Ukraine that has to be the focus of European efforts. Our help to sustain its defense efforts. It's a question of material as well as money. Strains over this will undoubtedly rise, but we must be clear we have to stand the course. That's the immediate task, and it will be for quite some time. Then we must open our doors and minds to the absolute essential task of bringing long-term stability to Ukraine. Membership of the EU isn't a quick and easy thing, and it's certainly right to point that out. But we must recognize that the alternative to the political and economic stability that the anchor of membership of the EU, as well as the process in that direction, could give, would be a zone of instability and conflict that unavoidably will drag the rest of our continent down as well. Whether our union is up to this task in the weeks, months, and years ahead remains to be seen. But in my opinion, the road ahead should be clear. We must give Ukraine the political perspective. We must help in the immense task of physical reconstruction, and we must assist in the essential political and economic transformation that the path towards the EU always entails. Few things will be as important and as demanding on the EU agenda in the coming years, and I naturally also include a country like Moldova in that perspective. One day, perhaps, although not immediately, the country of Belarus. This, in my opinion, is also the key to the future of Russia. It is only when Russia understands the futility and indeed the danger of trying to rebuild an empire and focuses on building a functioning nation state with its different minorities, that has any possibility of coming out of the profound crisis that the insane policies of the present president has thrown it into. Russia certainly has all of the resources and possibility of doing so. With well over 100 million people stretching 11 time zones, abundance of human and material resources, there's no reason whatsoever that Russia over time cannot build a stable and strong nation state. That would be also in our interest. St. Petersburg would again be a beautiful metropolis of attraction in our part of Europe. But as long as this Russia tries to rebuild an empire, it is bound to seek even further into isolation, conflict, and crisis, with all of the implications it has also for us. Twice within a century, the Russian state ultimately collapsed, where they tried to preserve a regime and an empire that was essentially unsustainable. If they are not careful, that might well be the path that Russia embarks on. Our possibilities to influence the path that Russia takes is very limited. But what we can and what we must do is to close the possibilities for its imperial temptation. And that's why our policies for and with Ukraine are so fundamentally important, not least for the future of Russia. The days since February 24 have been important in fairly obvious respects for our two countries. I think it should be said that Finland provided leadership also to Sweden on the path towards NATO. I pay my respect to the President and to all the others that made their critical contribution to this fundamentally important development. And I can only hope that what we've seen now is the emergence of a pattern that will remain. It's not a particularly well-kept secret that the foreign policy traditions of our two countries sometimes has been somewhat different. Geography and history, but also other factors, have played their part in this. Max Jakobsen once wrote that the Swedish political leadership for decades could, and I have to quote this in Swedish, they could mata sitt folk med den moraliska utrikespolitikens kaviar, medan finländarna var tvungna att nöja sig med realpolitikens havregrynsgröt. End of quote. I think it's untranslatable, but fundamental. Things might have changed slightly since Marx wrote this, but elements are certainly still there. Now we are in a new situation, in a radically torn situation for Europe, when war has returned and conflict will be us for years. We understand that we are truly together, that we will be sitting around the same tables in every respect, and that it's time to serve somewhat more of the same diet to our respective countries. A good start has been done in the weeks that have passed, but much more remains to be done in the years ahead. Thank you.
Mr. Bildt, let me thank you for a very insightful and inspirational lecture. And I'm sure that it gave us a lot of food for thought, but it also inspires for some further questions for which we now shall open the floor. Once you have the microphone, I ask you to identify yourself. And who would like to go first? Well, let me start myself. You already referred to the future Nordic cooperation in security and defense policy, and the fact that once we are all in NATO, it also makes it even easier. So it would be very interesting. Perhaps you would like to elaborate a bit.
No, this is sort of the next stage of our security cooperation. As I said, we've been, by commenting from the Swedish perspective, because Sweden has been thinking security in terms of Sweden. Surprise, surprise. And Finland has been thinking security in terms of Finland. Surprise, surprise. Now our respective security structures must, I wouldn't say give up that perspective entirely, but think in a wider perspective, in a wider both geographic and political perspective, and integrate with Norway, with Denmark, with the Baltic countries, with the other different actors. And this is sort of a transformation that is mental and political, not entirely easy, but needs to be done. But then, let's make one remark that perhaps I should make as well, that even if this is important, and NATO, and going into integrated command structures, sitting around the table with Americans and others to discuss the security challenges all of Europe, fundamental remains our national defense contributions. NATO and the Americans can, as I said, add critical components of vertical and horizontal escalation to our deterrence and stability efforts. But the essence must be done by ourselves. There is still, it was some time since I unfortunately went by ferry to Helsinki, but I always look when I go to, when you pass into Helsinki and pass Sveaborg or Suomenlinna, there are these words by Ehrensvärd that are written on the entrance to the fortress, which are also in Swedish, which is eftervärld, stå här på egen grund och lita inte på främmande hjälp. That remains important. Our own efforts are fundamental and will remain fundamental. But now we add other elements to it and add new perspectives. But the fundamentals must still be there.
Now there is someone who would pose the next question. Please.
Elina Valtonen, thank you so much, Mr. Bildt. I was wondering, because I think, and I'm pretty sure that most of us agree that when it comes to Finland and Sweden, for Finland especially, the main task in NATO is to independently and first and foremost be able to defend itself and to take care, of course, as a second step of this area together with the alliance. Now, how would you see, because you touched upon the European perspective in defense, the strategic compass, which came in a time which was difficult to predict what would happen, but would the same thinking be applied to Europe in the future as well, that the first task of Europe should be to be able more independently to take care of its defense, perhaps also crisis management and everything what comes to it? And would you think that that's actually not weakening, but very much actually strengthening the transatlantic link and our relationship with the United States as well in the future? Thank you.
Well, I think, as I said, I mean, we need to do more. We need to be able to do more ourselves. We need to strengthen European capabilities. I'm slightly allergic to the debate that was there a couple of years. It's been sort of modified somewhat lately, but there was talk about autonomy. You can't do anything with autonomy. You need capabilities. And Europe needs capabilities that are better. Some of those capabilities we need to operate autonomously in certain areas, absolutely, in certain situations. But the capabilities will also be, of course, a contribution to joint Atlantic European efforts. And as I said, we should be aware of the fact that the United States will be primarily occupied by China. I was struck by, and I wasn't entirely certain I was happy with the wording in Secretary Blinken's speech the other day, but I can understand it. He said that by far, I can't quote it verbally, but he said essentially the number one challenge for international order is China. I said, well, China hasn't invaded anyone lately, to my knowledge. They haven't threatened anyone with a nuclear weapon lately, to my knowledge. So I would not perhaps have myself phrased it like that. I would have had Russia somewhat higher up on that list of priorities when it comes to destabilizing the international order. But it is the American priority. And that means that we should have that at the back of our mind all the time, that we must do more. European Union, Nordic countries, bilateral, nationally, in order also to be able to say to the Americans that essentially we do things, but we do need you in a couple of sort of critical aspects. So that's, there I do think that, as a matter of fact, the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO could be a positive factor in the sense that we go in there as countries that are sort of committed to transatlantic security, no question about that. We go in there as countries committed to the European Union. We could be able to be instrumental in bridging the capabilities of NATO and the capabilities of EU so that we get together more of a strength. Because with the spectrum of threats or challenges that we have now, NATO can answer the most serious of them, but there's quite a number of them where EU comes in, either by itself or in cooperation with NATO. So that's sort of among the things that I think that we need to spend some brain power on in the years ahead.
Thank you. I think we can still take one or two questions.
Tuomas Forsberg, University of Helsinki. Thank you very much for your lecture. I would like to use this opportunity and ask something about your time as Prime Minister and Foreign Minister in Sweden. Do you remember anything like what kind of debates you had on Russia's future in the 90s and the first decade of 2000? And when did you change your view or your assessment of Russia, where it was heading? Do you remember any particular moment that you thought things are going to the wrong direction? För att undvika efterklokhet, men...
No, a good question. I belong to those that... first, I thought it was I invested personally quite a lot in trying to develop relationship with Russia, or with Russians. I mean, Russia is a fairly big place. And so I went, as a young politician at the time, I went to Moscow, I went to St. Petersburg, and established fairly good links with the emerging democratic political scene in Russia, and found them impressive. And some of them are still my friends. I've spent, as a matter of fact, the last few weeks having a couple of dinners with them, but none of those dinners have been inside the borders of Russia. Then I vividly remember we invited to Stockholm we had a seminar on Russia, and invited what I thought at the time and still think is, I think, the foremost historian of Russia, that is Richard Pipes. So he came over, and I vividly remember the conversation after lunch when I said, well, Professor Pipes, at the end of the day, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of Russia? And he said, I'm very optimistic about the future of Russia. And I thought, fine, until he continued. And he said, it's only a question of 3-4 generations. And that was the sort of the difference between the practicing politician and the historian. Then I remember also, I mentioned that Corfu meeting that we had. And after we have signed our respective treaties, Sweden and Finland, the EU and Russia, its partnership, we had a dinner between the heads of state and government, including then President Yeltsin. And he was, the dinner nearly went overboard in the sense that he nearly applied for membership of the EU. And I remember François Mitterrand went along quite a long bit for sort of allowing Russia into the European Union at that particular dinner. It was only Helmut Kohl who was someone who said perhaps things will be somewhat different. So it was an optimistic time. Did we believe that this was going to last? Can't really remember, but I remember also coming here to Helsinki and noted that the mood here was slightly different. Can't quote anyone in particular, but the mood was really tsarerna kommer och går. They come and go, these tsars, and Russia in some sort of way remains, which I thought was slightly too passive a policy at the time. But of course there was an historical perspective and wisdom in that as well. When did it change? I remember a meeting in Moscow in the 2003. And I was there with the business circle, RAND Corporation in the US, where I'm also on the board, still I'm on the board, and we operated as sort of a circle of Russian leaders and business leaders, and we were going to have dinner in the evening, and we had a dinner guest, and there suddenly arrived the message that Khodorkovsky had been taken off the plane in Novosibirsk by special forces and arrested. And I can still remember the mood around the table of Russian business leaders and some other leaders. I was one of them who spoke up and said, Stalin is back. There was others who just fell silent. It was going to be dangerous again. And there were a number of them in between. But the mood of that day was very heavy. Was it then it changed? I think the big change for Mr. Putin when it comes to building up this imperial, or whatever you call it, is probably when he came back for the second term. That's where I started to see the big change. Both in terms of this Eurasia Union and building something and call it imperial or whatever, and in terms of his fears of colored revolution. Remember the massive demonstrations in Moscow after elections in 2012, I think it was. And that, I think, profoundly changed his fear of what was going to be coming out of a democratic Ukraine or democratic, and it made him even determined to build some sort of thing. So from there, I think we are on a downward slide. But those are reflections from dealing with. And now, of course, we have a Russian leadership that seeks inspiration not in the future, but in the past. I can tell you my final story was from, by the way, one of those that a Russian friend I met recently who had been to Moscow very recently and talked to, shouldn't mention the name, but a very senior person, a prominent member of the National Security Council of Russia, and asked that person, who are really the people that President Putin listens to? Who are his advisors, really? And the person, member of the Security Council, said, oh, very clear, there are three of them. Oh, who said? Who are they? Well, the first is Ivan the Terrible. The second is Peter the Great. And the third is Catherine II. Who said, that's it. That's what he listens to. And I think that sort of sums it up, both in terms of the fact that that's what he seeks to achieve in some sort of way and listens to, and the fact that there aren't very many others around there, and the fact that inspiration is, as I said, not building a better future, but recreating some sort of path, but probably, as I think, a path to destruction. But that's another issue, remains to be seen. We'll see if Richard Pipes, I hope that Richard Pipes is still right, but we have some time to go.
Thank you very much.